For approximately 99% of your ancestors' history, the number of people who died specifically because they didn't have a house was 0. That sounds like a statistical impossibility, doesn't it? We are raised to believe that a roof and 4 walls are the only things standing between us and a very cold, very lonely death. We see the wilderness as a hostile void and the house as our only sanctuary. But if that were true, you wouldn't be here. Your lineage would have ended in a snowbank somewhere in the Pleistocene. So, how did they actually do it? How did ancient humans survive the brutal mammoth steppe or the blistering Saharan sun without a single brick, a single pane of glass, or a single mortgage? Why didn't the first cold snap of every winter simply wipe the human slate clean? And more importantly, if they were so good at living without houses, why on earth did we ever decide to start building them? But while it's tempting to think of our ancestors as master survivalists who could sleep on a bed of nails in a blizzard, the reality is that they weren't tougher than you. They were just much better at managing the laws of thermodynamics. You might think the most obvious solution would be to find a nice deep cave and stay there until the weather improved. It makes sense, right? A cave is basically a pre-built stone house. But here's the problem. Caves are actually terrible places to live. They are damp. They are often filled with the accumulated droppings of bats or the lingering scent of cave bears, and they are notoriously poor at managing smoke. If you light a fire in the back of a deep cave, you aren't making a home, you're making a smoker, and you are the salmon. Archaeological data shows that for the vast majority of the Paleolithic, humans didn't actually live in deep caves. They lived in the mouth of the cave, or more accurately, they lived under rock overhangs. Why choose the entrance over the deep interior? Because of a specific geological principle called thermal mass. The rock above and around a cave entrance acts like a giant battery for heat. During the day, it absorbs solar radiation. At night, it slowly radiates that heat back out. In 1994, researchers studying Paleolithic sites in the Levant found that the orientation of these cave dwellings wasn't random. Almost all of them faced south or southeast. Why? To catch the maximum amount of winter sun. These weren't just cavemen wandering into a hole, they were ancient energy auditors. They understood that the sun is a furnace and the mountain is a radiator. They were using the planet's own crust as a passive solar heating system. But if you think finding a good cave was the end of the story, you're missing the most dangerous part of the puzzle. What happens when there are no caves? What do you do when you're standing in the middle of a flat, frozen tundra with nothing but wind for 500 miles? But even the most perfectly oriented cave entrance is a luxury that disappears the moment you move into the open plains. In places like the Mezrich site in modern-day Ukraine, ancient humans faced a problem that would break a modern engineer. Around 15,000 years ago, there were no trees for wood. There were no caves for shelter. There was only grass, wind, and mammoths. So, they did something that sounds like the plot of a surrealist horror movie. They built their houses out of the bones of the dead. These weren't just piles of bones of the dead. These weren't just piles of bones. They were architectural masterpieces. A single hut at Mezrich was composed of the remains of approximately 95 different mammoths. The foundations were made of massive mandibles, or jawbones, interlocked like a puzzle. The framework was made of tusks, curved and lashed together to form a dome. This brings up a fascinating question. How did they keep the wind out? You can't just stack bones and expect to stay warm. The secret was the envelope. They would drape massive mammoth hides over the bone framework, but they didn't just toss them on. They weighed them down with more bones to prevent the wind from catching the edges. Inside, the space was small, usually only about 15 to 20 feet across. Why so small? Because a small space is a warm space. A human body radiates about 100 watts of heat. In a cramped bone hut, 10 people are basically a 1,000-watt space heater. Archaeologist Olga Sofer, a leading expert on these structures, pointed out that these bone huts were likely more thermally efficient than the drafty wooden cabins built by European settlers thousands of years later. They weren't just surviving the Ice Age. They were thriving in it. But if a bone hut is so efficient, why don't we see them everywhere? Why did humans in other parts of the world ignore the bone hut model and try something completely different? But you have to realize that a bone hut is a heavy, permanent commitment. It takes weeks to assemble and even longer to find the materials. For a group that needs to follow a migrating herd of reindeer or bison, a permanent bone palace is a death sentence. You can't take it with you. This is where the invention of the portable shelter changed everything. Think about the modern tent. You probably think of it as a flimsy piece of nylon for weekend getaways. But for ancient humans, the tent was a revolutionary piece of technology that allowed them to colonize the entire planet. In the Grotte Lazaret in France, archaeologists found evidence of a tent structure built inside a cave. Why build a tent inside a cave? Because, as we discussed, caves are damp and drafty. The tent acted as a second skin. It created a microclimate within a microclimate. This leads us to a startling realization. Ancient humans didn't view shelter as a single building. They viewed it as a series of layers. If you think about it, your clothing is just a very small, very tight house that you wear. In fact, the development of the eyed needle around 30,000 years ago was arguably more important for human survival than the invention of the wheel. Before the needle, humans wore draped hides, basically leather blankets. But blankets have gaps. Cold air leaks in, warm air leaks out. With the needle, humans could sew tailored clothing. They could create trousers and parkas that trapped a layer of air directly against the skin. Once you have a perfectly tailored suit of fur, your need for a massive insulated house drops significantly. You become the house. But if clothing is the primary shelter, does that mean the structures they built were just for show? Why spend any energy on a hut if your coat is warm enough to survive a blizzard? But while a coat can keep you alive, it can't keep you productive. You can't cook a meal inside your sleeve, and you can't raise a child in a parka. This is where the science of fire management becomes the real walls of the ancient world. We often talk about fire as a way to cook food, but its role in shelter was much more sophisticated. Ancient humans weren't just throwing logs on a pile, they were managing airflow. In many Paleolithic sites, we find hearths positioned in very specific spots. If you place a fire in the center of a small, hide-covered hut, you create a convection current. The warm air rises, hits the ceiling, and travels down the walls, creating a curtain of heat. This air curtain actually helps seal out the cold air trying to leak in through the bottom of the hide. However, there is a catch. If you seal the hut too tightly to keep the heat in, you'll die of carbon monoxide poisoning. If you leave it too open, you'll freeze. Ancient humans solved this using smoke holes and adjustable flaps, a technology we still see in traditional teepas and yurts today. They understood the fluid dynamics of smoke. They knew how to position the opening relative to the wind to create a vacuum effect that sucked the smoke out while keeping the heat in. But even with fire, even with clothing, even with hide tents, there is one factor that matters more than all the technology in the world. Why did some groups survive in the exact same environment where others perished? What was the invisible shelter that protected them? But it wasn't just about what they built, it was about where they chose to stand. Modern humans have lost the ability to read a landscape. We look at a flat field and see a place to build a subdivision. An ancient human looked at that same field and saw a frost pocket. They knew that cold air is denser than warm air, so it flows downhill like water and pools in the valleys. If you set up your camp in the bottom of a beautiful valley on a clear night, you will be 5 to 10 degrees colder than if you had set it up 50 feet higher on the slope. This is why we almost never find ancient campsites in the absolute lowest points of a landscape. They were masters of microgeography. They looked for lee sides, the side of a hill or a forest that is protected from the prevailing wind. A study of nomadic sites in the American Great Plains found that campsites were almost always located in spots where the surrounding topography reduced wind speed by up to 50%. This is free shelter. By simply walking an extra half mile to the right spot, an ancient group could save themselves the equivalent of several cords of firewood and a night of shivering. They were using the shape of the earth itself as a windbreak. But if site selection and fire were so effective, why did we ever stop? Why did we trade this freedom and this deep understanding of the land for the static, expensive, and often boring reality of a permanent house? But the shift to permanent housing wasn't a discovery of a better way to live. It was a desperate response to a change in the way we ate. When humans were hunter-gatherers, they were mobile. If the weather got bad or the resources ran out, they moved. Mobility was their primary survival strategy. But then, around 10,000 years ago, we started planting seeds. Once you plant a field of wheat, you are tethered to that spot. You can't pack up your wheat field and move it to the lee side of a hill when the wind picks up. You have to stay. And because you're staying, you have to store your food. You need a place to keep the grain dry and protected from rodents. The first permanent houses weren't built for people. They were built for seeds. At sites like Ohalo 2 in Israel, which dates back 23,000 years, we see the very first hints of this. They were building brush huts that were more substantial than a temporary tent, but still made of local plants. As agriculture took hold, these brush huts became mud brick houses. We sacrificed our mobility for security. We traded the microclimate of a perfectly tailored parka for the macroclimate of a heated room. But did this trade actually make us more comfortable? Or did it just make us more vulnerable to the environment when our technology fails? But even with the rise of agriculture, the transition to what we call a house wasn't a straight line. Many cultures maintained a dual shelter system for thousands of years. They would have a sturdy, permanent village for the winter and a mobile, lightweight camp for the summer. They understood that a house is a tool, not a cage. In the summer, a stone house is a stifling oven. In the winter, a hide tent is a constant battle against the wind. By using both, they got the best of both worlds. They were still in touch with the seasonal rhythms of the planet. They knew when the birds were migrating, when the sap was rising, and when the air was about to turn. In contrast, the modern house is designed to make the outside world irrelevant. We want the temperature to be exactly 72 degrees whether it's July or January. We have created a synthetic environment. But this brings us to a strange paradox. We are the most sheltered humans to ever live, yet we are also the most fragile. If your furnace breaks tonight, you are in a state of emergency. An ancient human in a mammoth bone hut would look at your emergency and laugh. They had 10 different ways to stay warm that didn't involve a thermostat. They had the social shelter of a tight-knit group, the biological shelter of a highly efficient metabolism, and the technological shelter of a million years of trial and error. But if you think their lives were a constant struggle against nature, you're missing the most profound part of their existence. They didn't feel like they were without houses. They felt like the entire world was their house, and they just happened to be sitting in one particular room of it today. They didn't have a front door because they didn't feel the need to lock nature out. They were part of it. They understood the wind because they lived in it. They understood the cold because they respected it. They didn't live without houses. They lived with a version of shelter that was so integrated into the landscape that it was invisible to us. This leads us to a question that most people never think to ask. What did they do for privacy? In a small hide tent or a bone hut with 10 other people, there is no personal space. Your life was entirely public within your group. This is another invisible layer of shelter, the social layer. In a cold environment, being alone is a death sentence. Not just because of the lack of help, but because of the lack of heat. Group living was a thermal necessity. We think of privacy as a luxury, but to an ancient human, privacy would have felt like a terrifying vulnerability. To be alone was to be cold. To be with the group was to be warm. The walls of their world were made of the people they loved. But while the social bonds kept them warm, it didn't solve the problem of the environment itself. How did they handle the extreme ends of the spectrum? How did they survive in the high Arctic or the deep deserts where even the most perfect site selection isn't enough? This is where the sheer diversity of human ingenuity becomes staggering. In the Arctic, the Inuit developed the igloo, a house made of the very thing that's trying to kill you, snow. An igloo works on the same principle as a mammoth bone hut, but it uses the insulating properties of trapped air bubbles within compressed snow. The inside of an igloo can be 40 to 60 degrees warmer than the outside air, using nothing but body heat and a small oil lamp. In the desert, the problem is the opposite. You don't want to trap heat, you want to shed it. Ancient desert dwellers used wind towers and subterranean rooms to take advantage of the Earth's cool interior. They were using geothermal cooling thousands of years before we gave it a fancy name. They were building houses out of shadows and airflow. None of these look like the house you're sitting in right now. They don't have shingles, they don't have drywall, and they don't have a mailbox. But they are, in every functional sense, superior pieces of technology. They are optimized for their specific environment in a way that our modern one-size-fits-all suburban homes will never be. But you might be wondering, if these ancient methods were so good, why did they disappear? Why don't we still live in bone huts or south-facing cave mouths? The answer is as much about politics as it is about physics. Permanent houses allow for the accumulation of stuff. You can't have a library, a loom, or a collection of fine pottery if you have to pack your house onto a travois every 3 weeks. Permanent housing allowed for the rise of the specialist, the person who doesn't hunt or gather, but stays home and makes tools, or art, or laws. The house became the container for civilization. But it also became a tool of control. It's very hard for a government to tax a group of people who can disappear into the forest with their house on their backs in 20 minutes. The permanent house made us legible. It put us on a map, it gave us an address. We traded our freedom for the ability to store more things. And in that trade, we lost something vital. We lost the generational knowledge of how to actually live on this planet. Most of us wouldn't know how to find a south-facing slope if our lives depended on it. We wouldn't know how to sew a waterproof seam with a bone needle. We wouldn't know how to bank a fire so that it stays hot for 8 hours without burning the house down. We have outsourced our survival to a grid that we don't understand and can't maintain. But even if we've lost the skills, our bodies haven't forgotten the history. Have you ever wondered why you feel so cozy when you're wrapped in a blanket in a small dark room while a storm rages outside? That's not a modern preference. That is your Pleistocene brain recognizing a good sight. That is the ghost of the mammoth bone hut calling out to you. You are hardwired to find comfort in a small, defensible, thermally stable space. Your home is a biological craving that predates the first brick by hundreds of thousands of years. We are still the same creatures who huddled together under a rock overhang in the Levant, watching the winter sun crawl across the floor. So, did ancient humans live without houses? Only if you define a house in the narrowest possible terms. If you define a house as a technology that creates a livable microclimate, then they had some of the best houses in history. They were just houses made of bone, hide, wind, and wisdom. They were houses that didn't leave a scar on the earth. They were houses that could move with the seasons. They were houses that forced you to be part of a community. And honestly, looking at the state of our modern world, with our skyrocketing energy bills, our lonely suburban isolation, and our total disconnection from the natural world, you have to ask yourself, who was really better off? But before you answer that, I want to challenge you to do something. Next time you're outside, don't just look at the scenery. Look for the shelter. Try to find the south-facing slope. Try to find the lee side of the wind. Try to spot the rock overhang that would have kept your ancestors dry 10,000 years ago. When you start to see the landscape through their eyes, the world stops being a hostile void. It starts being a home. You start to realize that you aren't in nature. You are a part of a very old, very successful system of survival. You are the descendant of people who could make a palace out of a pile of bones and a furnace out of a handful of dry grass. But if you're still not convinced, if you still think that our modern houses are the ultimate peak of human achievement, consider this. Our houses are built to last 60, maybe 80 years before they need a total overhaul. The mammoth bone huts of Mezrich stood for centuries. The cave dwellings of the Levant were used for nearly 100,000 years. Our permanent structures are actually some of the most temporary things we've ever created. We build things that are meant to be replaced, while our ancestors built systems that were meant to endure. They weren't just living for the night, they were living for the lineage. So, how did they do it? They did it by being smarter than the environment. They did it by being closer to each other. And they did it by recognizing that the best shelter isn't something you buy. It's something you understand. They didn't live without houses. They lived in a house that was as big as the world and as intimate as a heartbeat. And while we sit in our climate-controlled boxes, scrolling through pictures of the great outdoors, they were out there, truly living, in the only home humans were ever meant to have. But here's a question for you to weigh in on. If you had the choice, would you trade the convenience and privacy of your modern home for the deep connection and environmental mastery of an ancient hunter-gatherer? Or is the comfort we've gained worth the knowledge we've lost? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep digging into these kinds of historical rabbit holes, the kind that make you look at your own life a little differently, hit the subscribe button. We're going to keep exploring the how and why of the human story, one deep dive at a time. But for now, I want to leave you with one final thought. You probably think that as you sit there, you are perfectly safe. You have your walls, your insulation, and your heating system. You feel like you've finally conquered the hostile world that your ancestors struggled in. But here is the cold, undeniable fact. Your house is not a shield. It is a mask. It hides the fact that you, a biological organism, are now completely incapable of surviving on the planet that birthed you. If the power grid failed tomorrow, the very walls you're sitting in wouldn't protect you. They would become a tomb. For 99% of our history, we were the masters of the Earth's thermal laws. Today, we are just the lucky occupants of a system we no longer know how to build from scratch. Your ancestors didn't have houses, and they didn't need them. You have a house, and without it, you wouldn't last a week. That isn't progress, that's a hostage situation. Sleep well tonight.